Well, we saw last night that, if you can remember back that far, that we all have moments when we feel inadequate, maybe in your studies or in social situations, but especially, I think, in our Christian lives. And we heard Paul saying, stop looking at yourself and look at Jesus. And so the question now is, well, is Jesus enough? I know I'm inadequate. Is Jesus enough, or do I need an upgrade? You know, when you first get a mobile phone, and at first it's really exciting and it does everything you ever wanted. And eventually then your eyes are opened and you realize that your new mobile is laggy and slow and the screen is scratched or smashed and other people have better phones than you. And you wonder, can I get an upgrade? And I think it's like that in our Christian lives too. We look at ourselves and wonder, can I get an upgrade? But is there also a Jesus 2.0 app I need to download? Or is there an upgrade, a plugin, something I need to install that will really make my Christian life take off? And I think that's what the Christians in Colossae were asking. They weren't denying Jesus. You'll see that when you come through when you read through the book of Colossians. They're not abandoning Jesus, but they want an upgrade. They want to do more stuff. And what we're going to look at now in Colossians 1, verses 15 to 20. And by the way, if you want to stick with me all week long, we'll finally get to Colossians 3. You know, we'll come back every single day this week. And no, I'm just kidding. But we're still in Colossians 1, okay? You've got the whole year to study Colossians, but we're in verses 15 to 20. And I think what Paul does is he's saying, if you like, to the Colossians, look, you don't need an upgrade. You need to see Jesus widescreen, high def, 3D, surround sound. You need to see Jesus so perfectly that you wouldn't want an upgrade. So if you have your Bibles open by now, after my waffle, if you look at Colossians 1, I'm going to read from verse 15 to 20. He, that is Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And I think Paul shows us three simple things here. I mean, he shows us a vast amount, but in terms of our seeing Jesus, he shows us three things. And the first is that Jesus is God. And you see that in verse 15. Paul says there that he is the image of the invisible God. And so an image is like a photograph, like a likeness. I could have on my phone, I do have on my phone photographs of my family. I could show that to you. And if you hadn't met them, I could say, this is what they look like. This is an image of my family. And this PowerPoint has an image taken by the Hubble telescope. This galaxy, this nebula, is invisible to me. I look at the night sky, I can't see it, but this image has made the invisible visible. And what Jesus does is makes the invisible visible, and he's done it not in a photo, but in a person. And so in John 14, when Philip says to Jesus, show us the Father, Jesus says, I think he's a little bit exasperated. He says, don't you yet know me? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And earlier, at the beginning of John's gospel, in John chapter 1, John says, no one has ever seen God, but Jesus, who is in the closest possible relationship to God, the Father, or who is at the Father's side, Jesus has made him known. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He is God in person. But you might still ask, well, does Jesus really show us God? Or just a small scale model of God? You know, is Jesus like a child's Lego house rather than one you can actually live in? Is Jesus like God but shrunk in the wash? Well, have a look at verse 19. For in him, that is in Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And Paul will return to this again in Colossians. When you study Colossians, you'll see that. But what he's saying is all the fullness of God is in Jesus Christ. All that God is, Jesus is. Jesus is not a Matchbox toy that looks like the real thing. He is the real thing. So there's no upgrade to look for. There's no real God behind Jesus. that you might get to know one day, because in Jesus Christ, you have the fullness of the Father and the Son and the Spirit. Now they're different persons. Paul is not mashing them together, but to see Jesus is to precisely see all that God is in all his love and glory and might and holiness, and pick anything, his humility, his compassion, his grace. So why would you think you need to add anything to Jesus? Where would you look for a top-up or an upgrade? Because Jesus is God in person. And to have Jesus is to have everything. So Jesus is firstly the image of the invisible God, but also in verse 15, he's the firstborn over all creation. Now, that's a bit confusing. Does that mean that Jesus was the first created? Was he the first created being? Because sometimes the word firstborn just means that. So even the same word in Luke 2, we read that Jesus is Mary's firstborn son. She's the eldest child. But it can't mean that here, because if you look at verse 17, Paul says that Jesus is before all things. That is, he's before all created things. He can't be just the first created. And the key is that the word firstborn, especially in Jewish culture, look in the Old Testament, especially in Jewish culture, the firstborn can mean first, but it also means the most important, the one who will inherit, the one who gets the blessing, the one who will get the whole farm one day. And it's that sense in which Jesus is the firstborn. He is preeminent. He is the most important. He is the most significant person in creation, even before or over all space and time. He's the one who deserves all honor. So, who is Jesus? He's God in person, filled with all the fullness of God, deserving of all honor. So where else would you look? Where can you move on to someone bigger or better? What upgrade could you get? How could you add anything on top of Jesus that would make him more perfect? And everything of God is in Jesus. Jesus is not just a small scale model. He's God in person that you can know. Now, my hunch is today that you weren't about to deny Jesus or walk away from Jesus. For most of us, most of the time, our danger as Christians is that we underestimate Jesus. And sometimes that's why we want to walk away from him, but we underestimate him. But Paul says, look, to see Jesus is to see God, the invisible made visible, made flesh. Don't go anywhere else, because the only way is down. So that's the first thing Paul is saying here, that Jesus is God. He's the firstborn who will inherit all things. And then Paul goes on to explain why. And that is because Jesus is creator. And you see that in verses 16 and 17. And the key to understanding verses 16 and 17 is to look at the smallest words, the prepositions. Now, if my mentioning the word prepositions sends a sense of fear through your backbone, if you think back to school and when you were in English class, you couldn't tell a preposition from your elbow, don't worry. I just mean the small words like by and through and for and in, because when you look at these verses again, you see that all things were made by him and through him and for him and in him. And we're going to look at those one at a time. But verse 16, let me read it. For by him all things were created. Then jump down to after the hyphen. All things were created through him and for him. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. Let me show you why these are key. By him, at the beginning of verse 16, by him all things were created. And then secondly, at the end of the same verse, through him, all things were created through him. You've got by him and through him. Everything you see was made by Jesus. And everything you can't see was made by Jesus. By him and through him. You know, if you have an item of clothing, if you're wearing something, if you look out and pull out the label, by the way, if you're going to do that now, please put your Zoom camera off. But if you pull out a bit of label and have a look at it, you'll see that your jumper is made in China or made in Bangladesh, or the back of your phone, it's made in South Korea. In other words, everything that we buy is labeled so that you know who made it. But really, everything in the universe should be labeled made by Jesus, because the cotton that became thread that made this jumper was made by Jesus. And the air you breathe was made by Jesus. And the gravity that keeps you in your chair, or music that gets under your skin, is made by Jesus. And in case you miss it, says Paul, I'm going to say it twice in verse 16, by him all things were made. And verse 17, all things were made through him. They're all made by him and through him. And then in between, Paul lists examples of things that were made by him and through him. Things in heaven and earth, which really means everything in between. Things visible and invisible, which really means just about everything, doesn't it? And he lists thrones and dominions, which really might mean earthly kings or presidents or taoiseachs. They're all made by him. And he says rulers and authorities. Those are words he uses elsewhere sometimes to talk about spiritual powers, spiritual forces. Everything was made by Jesus and through Jesus, from galaxies to atoms, visible or invisible, physical or spiritual. So, how can you upgrade from Jesus? What would you add to Jesus? Well, anything you add to him was made by him, so it must be a step down. So all things were made by him and through him, and thirdly, they are made for him. And you see that also in verse 16. I remember at school, I had a woodwork class. I don't know if you had something like that. And I made a mug rack, you know, an ugly thing that sits in the corner and collects dust. And I proudly gave it to my mum. Look what I've made for you. It's a gift for you. And she had to use it, bless her. That was my creation for my mum. But what Paul is saying is that all creation is a creation gift for Jesus. Now, if you were to give a gift to a king, you might think, well, what can I give that's worthy of them, that's good enough, that's valuable enough, that's top quality enough? And Paul's answer is that everything, visible or invisible, you or me, was made by the king, for the king. Everything is made for his pleasure and glory, which means that everything, visible or invisible, must be very good. Because Jesus doesn't make junk and Jesus doesn't deserve junk. And all of creation is made by him, through him, and for him. And so it matters how you treat it. Every person was made by him, through him, and for him, so it matters how you treat them. And then fourthly, everything holds together in him. And you see that in verse 17. In him, all things hold together. I don't know if you've ever been watching Netflix and you're engrossed in the box set or the drama or whatever it is, and you're actually kind of in the world, in the story that's being created, and then suddenly the internet dies and the whole story dies. The world has disappeared that you're involved in. And in the same sense, Jesus doesn't just if Jesus didn't sustain the world, it would be gone instantly, like that Netflix movie. In Jesus, all things hold together, verse 17. The world only spins this second because Jesus still sustains it. In other words, Jesus didn't just fill up the petrol tank when he created it with unleaded, and then he's taken his hands off the wheel and he's letting the universe slowly run down. No. The world isn't held together merely by the laws of physics and subject to entropy. No. Yes, he made the laws of physics, but now still, verse 17, in him all things hold together. And that is true whether you're looking up in a telescope or down in a microscope. Our universe itself, so finely balanced, he alone sustains it every second. So, Paul is saying, you want an upgrade? You want something better? Where exactly are you going to go? What can you step up to? Nothing. Who else are you looking for? There's nobody else. And no, you may not be denying Jesus, but don't underestimate him either. For all things were made by him and through him and for him and exist in him. He is Lord over every square inch in all creation. There's not a single square inch over which Jesus as Lord doesn't cry, it's mine. And that's why your studies matter. You are exploring his creation. You're discovering how he made his world and how it ticks. And that's whether you're studying language or maths equations or psychological experiments or sports science or economics or whatever you're studying. There's nothing you can study, visible or invisible, that Jesus isn't Lord over. So study it to please him. And if all things were made by him and through him and for him and exist in him, then this world has purpose and you have purpose. I mean, you and I often feel insignificant and easily overlooked, and we often are at work or at home. Or we feel like spiritual midgets. And honestly, we live on a tiny island on a very small planet, and I've helpfully marked it for you on the next PowerPoint slide. We live on a tiny planet in a massive solar system on the outskirts of a galaxy amongst billions of other galaxies. But you were created by Christ and for Christ, and you were made for a reason. You have a purpose. And if all things exist by him and through him and in him and for him, then you are made with worth, because he never makes junk. You see, I could put paint on a canvas and it would be worthless, but Van Gogh can put paint on a canvas and it's worth millions. The value of the painting depends on the artist, and you are a work of art made by Jesus and for Jesus. Your worth is infinite. Yeah, I think we often feel insignificant. We feel throwaway. But Jesus made you for himself, and he decides what you're worth. And ultimately, of course, he counts that in drops of his own blood. And you are infinitely precious. And you have worth, and all creation has worth. So do you see that if you don't recycle your plastic water bottle, what are you saying? If you don't care about the environment, what are you saying? You're saying, in practice, here's something Jesus made, and it's not that great. I don't need to take care of it. But Jesus didn't make junk, either in people or in all things, and you were made for this king. And you see also, if all things are made by him and through him and for him, if they exist in him, then this world is not random, where random things happen. I mean, you watch the RTE news or anything else, and the world looks unpredictable. It looks like chaos reigns. It looks like fluke and luck are your best friends, but no, because Jesus is Lord, still is Lord today, and there is meaning and order, and so history is not just one darn thing after another. It's going somewhere. And your life is not just one darn thing after another. It too is going somewhere, and Jesus is Lord of all. You see, why would you upgrade from Jesus? Where will you find something or someone with more purpose or worth, or that gives you worth and meaning? And you see, when you underestimate Jesus, it's like sawing off the branch that you're sitting on. You're going to fall out of that tree. And if you shrink Jesus in your own eyes, then everything else falls apart too. But you and all things were made by him and for him, for his glory and pleasure. And all that sounds great, but that's not what we experience, is it? That in daily life, we don't see that so clearly. I mean, we know we live in a good world, but it is also a broken world. We know Jesus made the universe, but we also know it's currently a broken or a fractured universe. And so the focus from verse 18 to 20 is on how Jesus will fix it. Because Jesus is head of the church. And verse 20 at the end of this section shows what has gone wrong, because Paul says that through him, through Jesus, he will reconcile all things to himself. Jesus is going to reconcile. And when do you need reconciliation? You need reconciliation when there's been a problem. You need reconciliation when you've fallen out with someone, when the relationship is broken down. And by the way, of course, that's the basis of every single soap opera, isn't it? Like EastEnders, in almost every single episode, people fight, they fall out, relationships break up. But in EastEnders, there's always a longing for harmony, and then there's reconciliation. And there you go, there's the gospel according to EastEnders. But our hearts are made for reconciliation. We want reconciliation, and Jesus made all things for him, all people to know him and to love him. But our problem, of course, is that we've rebelled. We have broken away from God. And from the earliest chapters of Genesis, you see the fallout of the selfishness of sin. Because there's now enmity between us and God, and between husband and wife, and between us and animals, and between us and the earth, and we exploit it. And by Genesis 4, there's enmity between brothers. You have the first murder. And we caused this mess. We need reconciliation. We need to be brought back into fellowship. We need someone to make peace, as Paul puts it in verse 20. And God's rescue plan is Jesus and his church. And again, we're going to see that more briefly in verses 19 and 20. Again, we're just going to look at the prepositions. We're just going to look at the small words. It's in him again, through him again, to him, by him. And by the way, that's because this verses 15 to 20, Paul has constructed a bit like a poem. That there's mirror images here, like two facing pages of a book. But let me read verses 19 and 20. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. In him, the first one we saw earlier, that Jesus is not a small-scale model of God. He is fully God. And we are reconciled in him because only a savior that big can sort out our mess. You know, creation is so messed up by sin that Jesus can't just apply a can of touch-up paint. And I am so messed up with sin. I am far, far from God, and only a God this big is able to reconcile me. And only Jesus is, because he's fully God and fully able to save me. And that's in him, but there's also through him. You see how he does it in verse 20, that he does it through him to reconcile all things, to himself all things. You see, where else could you turn? The United Nations can't give you peace with God. There's no fudge to pretend your sin is trivial. There's no other name given under heaven to men by which we must be saved. You can only be reconciled through him. So we're reconciled in him, through him, and thirdly, to him. And that again is in verse 20, that he wants to reconcile to himself all things. And of course, you put these together, what is absolutely key is that we are reconciled by a person to a person. And salvation is not just a transaction, it's personal. Salvation is not just a legal verdict, it's personal. And again, we saw that last night, that you're drawn to a person, you're united to a person, you are in Jesus. Because really, the whole Bible is a love story, and it begins with God making us so that he can love us, so that he can know us. The Bible is a love story, but it starts by chapter 3 with a divorce. But it ends with a marriage. And it's Jesus reconciling us to himself. So the whole Bible is a love story that starts with a divorce and ends with the marriage. And you will know that in all the best love stories, from Robin Hood to Shrek to your average Disney, there must be a hero who will win his bride if they're to live happily ever after. And if Genesis starts with a divorce and Revelation ends with a wedding, we need a hero big enough to reconcile us, to save us. And through it all, Jesus is the one who draws us to himself. Yes, in him, through him, to him, and finally by him. He does it at the end of verse 20 by making peace by the blood of his cross. In other words, all this reconciliation is done by him, by his blood, by his cross. This same creator king, by whom all things were made and for whom all things are made, becomes what he made so that he can win his bride back by dying for her. But that's not all. Jesus' death doesn't ignore creation. Jesus' death also reconciles all things. I don't know if you noticed just how often Paul repeats himself. He says all things, everything, all creation, all things. 7 times in this passage, Jesus, he says, made all things. All things were for him. He reconciles all things. In other words, well, we often think Jesus died for me, and he did, and that's immense, but it's not all, because Jesus is about reconciling all creation. We read in Psalm 145 that Jesus loves all that he's made, or the Lord loves all he's made. In other words, God's world, the world around you, is not just a backdrop on a theater stage and human actors are the only ones who matter, because that would be to underestimate Jesus, because salvation is bigger than that. all of creation, all these galaxies too, were fractured by the fall. Our world is spinning off kilter, but Paul says in Romans 8, all of creation is groaning with pain as a result of our sin. And so all of creation is waiting for us, for God's children, his church, to be revealed, because then all of creation will also be restored with us. And just remember that Jesus is human, permanently human, as well as fully God. So he will enjoy his creation with us. He made it. He will redeem it. He will enjoy it with us, physically walking with us in the new or the renewed creation. Because Jesus will restore all things. But of course, there is one part of creation that stands head and shoulders above the rest. And that is the church. And you see that in verse 18. He is the head of the body, the church. I said earlier that the Bible is a love story, that all creation matters. But in this love story, it is about the king who wins a bride, and the bride is the church. And it's not so much you and me individually, but corporately as his people, united together with Christ as our head. And of course, I get it, CU is not a church, but we are all part of Jesus' church. And Jesus is our head, and we are united to him. And even in the second half of verse 18, you can see it's because we're united to Jesus that we don't need to fear death. Verse 18, he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. And on this occasion, when Paul is using the word firstborn, he is using it that he's like our elder brother, because he went first. So I don't know about you, but I have an elder brother. He was the first to negotiate for more pocket money. He was the first to have a girlfriend. He was the first to get his own room, first to crash the car. We'll not go into that. But Jesus is our older brother who goes first. And in this sense, he's gone through death. It's a bit like a needle pushing through a black cloth. We can't see what's on the other side, but because we're the thread, he goes through and he pulls us through with him. He's gone through death, and because we're united to him, we don't fear death. Death, our biggest enemy, our final enemy, but Jesus has been there and done that, and his resurrection is the beginning of our resurrection and the renewal of all creation. And he's done all this by reconciling all things in him, through him, to him, and by him. So let me finish. I think there's a real danger for all of us every day that we underestimate Jesus in our hearts. We're almost embarrassed by him. He's almost too fragile. He's someone that we can't quite bring into the 9-to-5 life on college. He's just too small. And there's a real danger in our CUs that we then present a gospel that is too narrow. It's just me and Jesus, and that's too small. And we underestimate Jesus, and we underestimate or undervalue his salvation. But Jesus is reconciling all things to himself, because all things were created by him and for him. And he's not going to chuck it all out like a cake mix gone bad, but he will reconcile and restore all things. And you and I get to be part of that today. Your CU is part of that. That is, in everything we do or everything we say is to acknowledge that Jesus is Lord. And in everything we do, to do it in his presence and for his glory. And then, yes, of course, on every chance we have to tell our friends, look at Jesus, won't you? Look how wonderful he is. And you too were made by him and for him, and he loves you so much that he would rather die than be without you. Come, let's enjoy him together. So I'll pause there. And the next slide has 2 questions, and they'll be in the chat room, in the chat screen, so that you can discuss them in your rooms for about 8 or 9 minutes. But how do you personally underestimate Jesus? And in particular, what does that look like for you in practice? Because I think in our heads, we'd all say, yes, Paul, I agree with everything you said, but our hearts demonstrate that we don't believe it. So how do you underestimate Jesus? What does that look like in practice? Then the second question is, Jesus created all things, sustains all things are for him. how should that transform all you personally do? And also secondly, what your CU does.